Following tape was made in August 1970 at the residence of Mrs. Orrin Merritt in Whiting, Iowa. Interview was conducted by Mr. Hugh Amon. Others present were Mrs. Hugh Amon, granddaughter of Mrs. Orrin Merritt. Mrs. Hugh Amon's maiden name is Bonnie Stubblefield.
No, you moved. You were born then in Batavia, Iowa.
No, that's where my father.
Oh, that's where your father. What was his name, Grandma?
Wolf, William Wolf.
William Wolf, and according to that, he was born in 1857.
Yes.
And what was your mother's maiden name?
Teeter.
Teeter.
And she was born in Pennsylvania, Cambria County. Strange, I can't think of that name right now.
Well, yeah, come back to me. And where did they meet then? Where did they get married?
Well, my mother, her mother died when she was about 6 weeks old, and her father about a year later. So she was raised by relatives, and at last with her grandparents, and their name was Roberts.
I see.
And I don't know how or what year that she came to Iowa.
I see.
But father was born in Iowa.
I see.
And they were married in 1881.
How many, and then was he farming then when...
Yes, he was always a farmer.
I see. And how many children, how many brothers and sisters did you have then, Grandma?
I had 3 brothers and 2 sisters.
What were their names?
Ira was the oldest. He was born in 1883. And in the meantime, I suppose he must have been about a year old or a year and a half old. And the folks moved to Nebraska.
Oh, I see.
In Gage County near Beatrice.
I see.
And my brother Charlie was born there in August 1885. And Susan in 1887 and Louis in 1889.
Where was your father when he moved from Iowa? Where had he moved from? When he moved from Iowa to Nebraska, where had...
He had always lived in Iowa until he moved to Nebraska.
Do you know where in Iowa, Grandma?
Yeah, near Batavia.
I see. Why did he move to Nebraska, do you know?
I suppose homestead.
Mm-hmm.
If I recall right, they had a 40-acre piece of ground.
I see.
And had fruit of all kind on it.
Oh.
But, and of course they'd have to have a little farm ground and a little pasture, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But his folks kept writing to him to come back to Iowa, so he moved back. And that would have been between the years of 1889 and 1892, because I was born in Iowa.
Oh, I see. After they moved back,
yes,
then you were born.
Near Libertyville.
I see. And how long did they live there then before you moved to...
In 1896, the spring of 1896, they moved to Devil's Lake, North Dakota.
Oh,
and Father was still searching for land.
I see. Was there... I mean, he was searching for land rather than any reason in Iowa. I mean, it wasn't drought or anything that forced him out of Iowa.
No.
He was looking for a good homestead.
Yes, that's right.
I see.
He wanted a home for his family. And it was a very disappointing place in North Dakota.
I see. Why was that?
Well, it was like way out in nowhere. I got a letter from my brother not too long ago. Now, I didn't know why my folks went to North Dakota.
I see.
And I wrote and asked my brother. And he told me that Father was, searching for a dream. In other words, he went different places looking for land. He went to Minnesota at one time, Montana, Wisconsin.
This was before he was married?
No, after we'd been to North Dakota.
I see.
In the fall of 1896 then, we moved to McCook County in Salem, in the town of Salem.
In South Dakota?
Yes.
Yeah.
We lived in the town of Salem that 1 year anyway, and Father and the boys farmed out in the country.
Oh, I see.
And then we moved on a farm out in the country, about 4.5 miles southeast of Salem. And we lived there until the fall of, what did you say that was, 1889?
1899.
1899,
Yeah.
in October. And then we went to Kansas, went by covered wagon. We had 2 covered wagons and a covered spring wagon.
Is that right?
Father drove the front wagon, and usually my oldest sister rode with him. And then the 3 boys rode in the next wagon, and then Mother and my youngest sister and I rode in the spring wagon when we went to Kansas.
Mm.
And we went to Pawnee County, Kansas, near Larned. And we were there 1 season, and the grasshoppers were so bad that was no good. And in the meantime, he had a cousin come down from Sherman County, Kansas, on the way to Oklahoma. He was also searching for land. And he came back. He didn't find anything in Oklahoma that suited him. So he wanted Father to move to Sherman County, which Father did then, that fall. And we lived in a bank barn for a short time until they got the sod house finished.
You lived in a what?
Bank barn.
What is that? What was that, Carol?
Well, that's like a hill, and you cut down into it. And this was just cut in on the top side. On the back, it was all wood.
I see.
But it was just on the level where the horses could look out right on the ground, you know. And we lived in, that is, done our eating. I think we possibly slept in the covered wagons. And water was a problem there. We wasn't able to get water to mount anything. But they did raise some corn and some broom corn and some cane.
Some what kind of corn?
Broom corn.
Broom corn.
Broom corn, the stuff you make broom
Oh,
out of.
I see. I see.
And they did raise a fairly good garden 1 year, but hailstorms and hot winds and grasshoppers, we were worse off when we come out of there than we were when we went in. And we came back, we seemed to travel in the month of October. We come back to McCook County and moved on the quarter section just north of the one we had left when we went to Kansas.
I see.
And we lived there until 1905, and my oldest brother still lived there, and we moved to another place 2 miles, a mile south and a mile east of that. And we were near a school. We had some terrible snowstorms during those winters. And then I don't know just what year it was. It must have been about 1907 that we moved to another place a mile north of where we were. And the folks lived there until 1914, and Father had fell and cracked some ribs and wasn't able to farm anymore. The boys had all left in the meantime. And he had a sale in the fall of 1914. And we spent the winter 2 miles west of Canastota doing chores for a family by the name of Van Wert, and my youngest sister had worked for them, and I had also worked for them. And we did chores. Father had kept 4 head of horses and 2 cows, and they were furnished feed, and we could use of all the things in the cellar there. They practically furnished our food and for the stock too. And then in the spring we went to my brother-in-law's and stayed for a little while, and then we moved to the town of Salem. My father bought a place there. And
Well, okay, let's stop a while. We'll go back, Grandma. When your parents moved from Iowa to Devil's Lake in North Dakota, how old were you then?
well, I was 3 years old in the fall, and this, I don't know if it was spring or fall, but I think it must have been spring when we went.
I see.
And we went by train.
Oh, you went by train that
Yes.
time.
Mm-hmm.
That was all, and you went all the way from where was it? Where were you now?
Fairfield, Fairfield, Iowa, to Devil's Lake, North Dakota.
Now this land, that was homestead land given up by the government to you?
I can't tell you that. I don't have all the details.
Well, I mean, you don't have to have the entire story, but you know, as much as you can remember offhand, Grandma, that's fine.
Well, as I said, I didn't know why the folks had went to North Dakota. I guess I never was interested enough to know.
And of course, that was before you were born, too. So.
No, I wasn't.
Or, I mean, when you were just a little baby yet. So.
I was past 3 years old because I'm 3 years and from November to July older than my youngest sister.
I see.
The year 1896, the land or country of Ramsey County in North Dakota was open for homesteading. Yeah, Father went there to homestead. In March, Father loaded his belongings in a freight car and headed for Devil's Lake, the county seat of Ramsey County. Mother, Uncle John, that was Father's brother, and us 5 kids followed on the passenger train a day later. North Dakota at that time was a new experience to Father, being raised in a well-populated state of Iowa, and his experience in Nebraska, where 3 of us were born, where it was populated like Iowa. When he got out of the small city of Devil's Lake and could look for miles in any direction and not see a building of any kind, trees, nothing but prairie. And he had the beginning of a large family on his hands and no place to put them. No house, barn, or well, nothing but prairie. No chance of getting a crop in to harvest. He was just beside himself. Mother was pregnant, expecting a baby in July. He realized he had made an awful mistake in not coming up to see what he was getting into. He finally found 20 acres broken up he could rent for the year, 16 miles northeast of town. He got Ira started to putting in wheat. Then he took the train and came down as far as Carrington to look farther, but it was too far between farmhouses, so came back and said, "We are getting out of here and going back to civilization as soon as the wheat is harvested." About the 20th of October, we had about 1/2 inch of snow. Uncle John had worked for the Dutchman through the summer, but was ready to try something else, so everything was loaded in the freight car once more and billed to Salem, South Dakota. Father accompanying it. Mother and now 6 kids and Uncle John in the passenger coach. I am not positive on dates, but I think the dates you have on our canvas experience is correct, as we were down there 4 years, returning to Salem in 1893. No, you're wrong, buddy. It was 1892.
And that's a letter from who?
my brother Louis in North Dakota.
I see.
And he said,
well, maybe the paper could be wrong too, you know.
well, he said 1903, but I know I was 10 years old just after we come back from Kansas, and I was born in 1892. So that would have been 1902.
Of course, you wouldn't remember, but where did they live then when they were in North Dakota?
We lived in a store building, in the back of an empty store building.
I see. In Devil's Lake? Or?
Yes, in the town of Devil's Lake.
And then he would go out and farm this...
But at last, it seemed to me like we must have been out on a farm. And this I can remember so well, because the man that was going to farm the land evidently ate with the folks, and we had had our supper, and Mother had made supper for this man, and she had some dried peaches cooked. And I had got up to the table and was helping myself with my hands to those dried peaches. And Father took me down and spanked me, and that's the only time I ever remember Daddy spanking me.
Is that right? Well, that's probably why I remember. You're talking about what kind of farm implements was your father using then? I mean, did he have his own horses? And
he had his own horses, yes.
And all that?
But I wouldn't know at that time what kind of machinery he had.
I see.
But when he farmed out of Salem there, out in the country at Salem, did you ever see a cultivator that would just fall to pieces when it was unhooked from the horses?
No, I've heard your Archie was talking about that.
Yeah.
That they just would collapse
Yes,
when they wouldn't move.
It just seemed like it had no tongue at all. The wheels was on an axle, of course, and then a kind of an arch from one axle to the other, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't know how the shovels was fastened on. I don't remember that. But it had no tongue at all. But later he had, of course, cultivators with tongues in them. And he done a lot of plowing with a walking plow, and I can remember that so well because I loved to follow along in the moist furrows, follow Daddy.
Why did he move to Salem, South Dakota from Devil's Lake? Did he have friends down there, or don't you know?
I think Mother had an uncle or a great uncle by the name of Dan Good. I think it was through him. I'm not sure, but I think it must have been.
I see.
Through Uncle Dan.
How old were you when you really started remembering things about your...
I can remember a little bit when we were in Iowa before we went to North
is that
Dakota.
right?
I can remember one of my brothers pulling me in a little wagon out to must have been the orchard, because I can remember red apples, and Father throwing sticks up in the trees to knock walnuts down.
The people up at Devil's Lake, were they all similar to your father, or were these immigrants from Europe, or
I really don't know.
Remember?
I really don't know.
How was it at Salem? Do you remember how it was at Salem when you moved there, Grandma?
Well, there was quite a few nationalities. That was a well-settled country.
I see. That was well settled already.
Yes.
Then,
they called northwest of Salem the Swede settlement.
I see.
And where we lived, there was quite a lot of German Catholics. And down by Montrose, they called those the Irish Catholics.
I see.
But a lot of the people had lived there all their lives.
Oh, I see. So, I mean,
It wasn't a new populated country.
I see. There weren't Germans and Swedes coming over.
No.
Maybe a few, but you say most of the population had lived there quite a while,
yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I see. Do you... were railways the main way of travel then if you went from one place to another over any distance? Did you go by train, or did you go by horse, or...
Well, that was in the horse and buggy days and wagons. Let's see, this must have been about 1912. My brother Ira, that's my oldest brother, and my mother and I went by wagon from Salem to Worthington, Minnesota.
Oh, I'll be glad.
They stopped overnight in Sioux Falls. My folks belonged to the Brethren Church, and there were some Brethren people that lived in Sioux Falls
I see.
that had come to, we used to have church in a schoolhouse, and these people had come to church. And then when folks went to Worthington, they stopped overnight with them.
You went from Salem to Sioux Falls in one day then
Yes.
by wagon,
Mhm.
you say? How old were you then, did you say?
I suppose I must have been about 12.
I see. Were there roads then?
Oh, yes.
I mean, were they
They were
gravel?
not-
Were they kept up good like the gravel roads are now?
No, I don't think there was many gravel roads.
I see. It
In,
was just
in the
dirt
spring of the year when the snow went away,
Oh.
the roads were in awful shape
Yeah, I
lots of times.
What about, for what reason did you go to Worthington, just to visit then? Or?
Well, people that belong to church, I don't understand all this myself, but
Uh-huh.
that was the nearest brethren church
I see.
to Salem.
Oh, I see.
And the folks' membership letter was at Worthington.
Oh, I see.
And they went to what is called the Love Feast. It's a series of sermons, meetings.
I see.
And then they have picnic dinners. And then at last they have what is called the Love Feast. And that's about as nearly as they can enact the Last Supper.
Oh, I see. I see. Was that, were people very religious in those days? I mean, you mentioned the German Catholics. Did they have their own church?
Yes, they have a wonderful church at Salem and 2 schools. I don't know what more schools now, but at that time there was a wonderful Catholic church and 2 schools.
Was there any animosity between religious groups in those days? Do you remember?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
We had wonderful neighbors, Catholic neighbors,
I see.
and we went to either the Methodist or the Presbyterian church.
Mm-hmm. I see.
It didn't make any difference what your religion was.
Yeah,
I don't think. We were never mistreated in either church.
I see. Did you have, were people that, were there any such thing as preachers or ministers or priests that would would go from house to house that for people that couldn't get to a church?
Well, not necessarily like that, but they did come in occasionally and preach.
I see.
That was in, as I say, this community where they had church in the schoolhouse.
I see.
Now there was 3 different ministers came from Worthington, Minnesota, and preached there at different times. And the ministers from the Methodist Church at Salem used to come occasionally.
I see. Talking about schools, how much schooling did you have, and where did you start school and so forth?
I started school in Kansas,
Oh, I see.
in a school near London, Kansas. But I was sick so much that I missed out on a lot of school. And while I was in the 7th and 8th grade in some grades, I was way down the line in others.
I see.
And I was sick so much that the teachers just put me in wherever I could get along.
Did everybody have their own books in those days, or did you have to buy books, or did you just use books that were in the schoolhouse?
I think we bought our books. Now, I'm not sure. Now, when our kids went to school, the books were furnished.
Mm-hmm.
And Chuck and Elsie went to the same school from the beginning to the 8th grade.
Oh, yeah, right. When you went back, were the schools in Kansas better than the schools were in South Dakota, or don't you remember?
They were just country schools.
They were just country schools.
This school that I started the school at, there was a farmer that taught school,
Oh.
and when it was time for him to work in the field, his wife taught. They had 3 boys come to school, and that was a small school. There wasn't many pupils there.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you went back to Salem, did you go to a country school there, or did you go into the town to go to school?
No, I never went to town school.
I see.
When we moved to Salem, Ira and Charlie and Susie and Louie went to town school there
I see.
until we moved to the country, and then they went to a country school, 1-room schoolhouse.
These teachers, would they live with a nearby farmer then that taught in the school?
No, the first school I went to after we come back from Kansas lived in Salem, and she drove a horse Her father built a barn up the schoolhouse, and she drove a horse.
You don't remember what her name was?
Yes, her name was Ella Kramer, and I have her picture.
I see. Make sure you mark that down. Well, it's on the tape, I guess. How much education do you remember that the teachers had? Were they college graduates in those days, or what?
No, I think if they had an 8th grade education, they could teach.
I see. What subjects did they teach you in school in those days?
Well, there was reading and writing and arithmetic, physiology, history, geography, and civil government. Yet I never took civil government, but the kids did, some of the kids did. And also South Dakota history.
I see. How did the parents of, like nowadays everybody wants their kids to get very well educated. What was the opinion then? I mean, were parents as education conscious then as they are now, or?
Well, in one respect, no, because the big boys worked until all the fall work was done, and then they come to school, and then when the spring work began, they were out of school again. But the parents did want their kids to have an education, but if they had an 8th grade education, they didn't insist they went on to.
Did many kids that you knew go on to high school, or was that?
When we were out to Chamberlain, yes.
Oh, I see.
Some of the neighbor kids.
What kind of games did you play when you were kids, like when you went to school and around the house?
Pump, pump, pull away. And
things haven't changed that much.
No. Tag.
Yeah. Play any baseball, softball?
Yes.
Yeah.
Baseball, not softball.
Yeah, softball. That's something.
And when it was stormy, we played mumble peg, if you know what that is.
Yeah, with the knife, yeah.
Or fruit basket.
No.
Boston Exchange.
No, what was fruit basket?
Well, the kids sat in their seats, and they would call out the name of some fruit. You each had a name.
Oh, I see.
And you was to try to change, these two fruits was try to change seats. And the one that was it, shall I say, was supposed to try to get a place.
Oh, I see. There would be a third person.
Yes.
Yeah, I see. And what was this other one then? What'd you say, Boston?
Boston Exchange. Well, it was over the same plan, only I suppose they used town names.
Oh, I
instead of
see.
fruit.
I see. When you were living up there as a child, what kind of did the food you eat, was most of this grown on the farm, or did you buy a lot of stuff?
Most of it on the farm. If it was a good year, my folks always raised a good garden.
I see. And then you do a lot of canning. And
yes, and a lot of vegetables like beets and turnips and rutabagas, parsnips, things like that was stored in the cellar for winter.
What about fruits, or were they shipping fruits in those days? I mean, could you buy oranges and apples and?
Yes, and much cheaper than they are today.
And they would come from Florida and California?
I suppose. That's what amazes me nowadays. It's why they have so much better transportation and everything is so much higher than it was in those days.
But you could buy that real cheap. Was it fresh, or was it,
It was fresh.
It wasn't rotten when you got it or
No.
anything? I see.
No.
And it was relatively inexpensive too, you say?
Well, Orrin said at one time that they got a whole peck of oranges for a quarter. And I know you could get a lot more bananas for a quarter than you can get nowadays.
Is that right? Even
And they were nice bananas too.
And I assume then you made your own bread and things like that.
Yes.
Your mother would bake.
Yes.
What about?
Mother baked twice a week in big loaves of bread, believe me.
Summer and winter, the cook stove went. What
That's
did you use for fuel? Coal or what?
Well, not much wood, and when we lived in Kansas, we used a lot of cow chips, if you know what
Is that
that
right?
is.
Yeah.
They call them buffalo chips,
Yeah.
but we went to the,
Is that right?
ranch pastures and picked them up anyway.
I'll be darned. They give off a lot of heat. Do they last a long time? Or?
They make good heat if you don't have them dried out too much. They
What?
make a lot of ashes, but then they make good heat.
Did they have any odor to them?
Oh, not bad.
Not any. I mean, nothing that you could. You would think that it could
Well,
be bad.
I don't think people were so air pollution them days as they are now. Because we used to go to the pig pen and pick up cobs out of that, and that wasn't very frigid.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You would burn a lot of cobs.
Yes,
Too.
uh-huh.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
No, there was no coal bought unless it was in the heart of winter, when it was really cold.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was coal bought.
How were your wells for water dug in those days? Did they have machines to do that, or did they dig them by hand, or don't you remember?
Well, I don't know about any place where we lived. The wells were already dug, except in Kansas, and in Kansas they used a well drilling machine,
I see.
and that's what they used at our place in Dakota, where Orrin and I live.
I see. Did you read a lot when you were a child? Did people read a lot of books and newspapers and magazines, or not?
I suppose some people did, but my father took the Kansas City Star. I think it was a weekly paper for a long time, but I don't believe they ever took a daily paper.
I see.
But they did read books and magazines, some, but not like you see on the newsstands nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Did Salem? They had a weekly newspaper? Did they when you were?
They had two.
I saw they had two separate newspapers.
Yes, one was the Salem Register. And I can't think what the other one is now, but they had two.
I see. In those days, when you were a child in the late 1890s and early 1900s, did there seem to be more sickness then than there is now? Were people sick a lot, or?
You don't think so. Or if they did, people doctored themselves instead of having doctors. When we lived in Kansas, we had the smallpox, and Mother had a medical book. I can't tell you for the life of me now what it was, but she always referred to that.
I see.
And that told her the different drugs to use and how to use them.
Hmm.
And Mother was a good doctor. And we lived 20 miles from Goodland, Kansas. When we lived in Sherman County,
Mm-hmm.
That's where Father homesteaded. And when we had the smallpox, Mother took a one horse and a top buggy and went to Goodland to get medical supplies. And it was a terrible windy day. It even raised the corner of the roof on the house where we lived in. And she said it would blow the horse out of the track as he went along. But she made the trip alone and got medical supplies for us. And we all got through this smallpox all right.
All your brothers and sisters and your father and everybody had smallpox?
Not Father and Mother. They had been vaccinated, but we children were not. My youngest brother, Louis, was herding cattle for a family by the name of Smith. And Mrs. Smith had been in the east somewhere visiting, and when she came back, she brought smallpox. So Louis had them first. And Charlie was working for a rancher south of us, so he had them last. But Arthur and I and Ira and Susan had them all at the same time. And the folks gave us whiskey to make us break out. Well, Susan was the only one that liked whiskey, so she got by easy. And I always thought it burned so bad, and I'd hold the last mouthful in my mouth till Mother left the room, and then I'd spit it out. But Ira and Arthur and I were in the same room, in the living room, when we had the smallpox.
Changing the subject, were there any Indians around Salem when you were a child, or were they all?
I never saw an Indian, only in a circus parade.
Is that right?
Until the spring of 1919, when Mother Merritt and I went to Chamberlain, went by train to Chamberlain. We had to lay over in Mitchell, and that's where I first saw my Indians.
I see. So they weren't traveling
No.
out then at all.
But our place at Chamberlain, where we bought, there was an Indian trail came right down by the house, and we saw quite a few Indians. And they, in the fall of the year, they bring wild plums and wild grapes.
Oh yeah.
And trade them if they could for chicken or bread or something like that.
Well, one other thing, do you remember about circuses? Did they have a lot of traveling shows in South Dakota then?
They did, yes. They were good ones, I would say. We never went to many of the shows, but the folks would take us to the parade.
I see. Were these regular circuses and things like that?
Yes.
I see. How would they travel, by railway or?
I think mostly by their wagons at that
I see.
time. That is, unless they were making a long trip,
Mm-hmm.
then they went by train.
Do you remember the first movie you ever saw?
Yes, I do, very well.
When was that now?
Well, it must have been when I was about 17 or 18 years old.
Which, that would be about when, 1920?
Well, you'll
Let's
have to...
see, 10.
I can't figure in my...
What year was it? 92 or 93?
92.
92, okay. Yeah, that'd be about 1920. No, it'd be about 1912. 19, about 1912, 1913, 14. Okay.
My brother Louis took my sister Arthur, the one that's younger than I, and I to Canastota. They had a sports day in Canastota every year. And they had this movie in a tent. And it was blue and white pictures, and it was of Jesse James.
I see.
I'll always remember that.
What, was it a cowboy movie or?
Oh, Jesse James, The Life of Jesse James.
I see. How long did it last? Do you remember?
No, I don't remember. The picture was not too plain. It was kind of blurry. But,
were people quite impressed with that? Did they think that was quite a?
I really don't remember.
I see.
They used to have chautauquas. Father used to take us to those.
What would they talk about at those chautauquas?
Well, there were some comedians, and I don't remember any special theme that they talked about.
I see. Okay, now you were telling about the narrative. You had your father, let's see, sold his farm in 1914, and you moved to Salem.
No, he was renting. He didn't own a farm.
Oh, he sold. Oh, I see.
He had a sale, sold off his livestock and machinery.
And then you moved into Salem then?
In the spring of 1915.
You moved into Salem.
Yes, in the town of Salem. The
I
folks
see.
bought a home in Salem then.
I see. And your father did what then?
He worked on the section and did odd jobs.
What was life, in Salem there, were people friendly amongst themselves? Did they visit a lot in those days?
Yes.
There was none of the sitting home, well, of course, no TV. But
No, there was no TV, no radio.
Yeah,
at that
people
time.
visited a lot, did they? Did they have any band concert in the town in the summertime?
I don't remember about band concerts, but Salem did have a band.
I see. Did they have a baseball team and that type of thing too?
Yes, I imagine so.
I see. What were Christmases like then? Did you get a lot of toys when you were...
No.
No? Were there a lot of toys to be had in those days, or didn't people give toys?
Well, my folks couldn't afford
Oh, I see.
to buy things like that. My first Christmas in Salem, my brother Ira was janitor at the Methodist Church, and my brother Charlie took me to the church one afternoon to see the Christmas tree. And that's a sight I'll never forget.
Is that right?
That was the biggest, most beautiful tree I ever seen.
What did they have it decorated with, do you remember?
I think candy beads and popcorn and all the ornaments, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't tell you. I suppose I stood with my mouth open and with awe and awe.
In 1914, did you know that a big war had started in Europe then?
In 1914.
First World War, or didn't this really impress people in South Dakota? Did they think this was just another war in Europe, or was it something that people kept up with in South Dakota?
Well, they really couldn't have talked too much about it because I don't remember. But Orrin and I was married in the fall of 1915.
Yeah, let's talk about your husband. Tell me a little about him, Grandma. Where he was born, when he came to South Dakota.
He was born in Norwegian Bend, up northwest here.
Is that a town in Iowa, or was it?
No, it's a community. I don't know why it was called Norwegian Bend, unless it was Norwegian people lived up there, and it was in the bend of the river, I suppose.
Where was this, in South Dakota, or?
No, here in Iowa.
Where was this?
Well, it's up towards Zalbaton or off up in there somewhere.
Technically Whiting Falls.
Oh, I mean, it's just up here
Yeah,
along the river, was it, or?
Yeah, Baton.
It must have been, because
Oh,
I don't know that I was ever there,
I see.
but it was called Norwegian Bend.
And what year was that then? 19
He was-
or 18?
1893.
1893, I see.
April 1893.
And when did he come to South Dakota then?
In the fall of 1905.
I see.
And they moved on the farm just south of where my folks lived.
I see. Do you know why his folks moved to South Dakota, Grandma?
Have a better living. They rented here when they lived on different farms around.
Mm-hmm.
And then they finally bought a home in Whiting, but they farmed out in the country.
I see.
And then GrandmaMerritt, Orrin's father, went to South Dakota with a breaking plow and his horses and broke prairie.
Is that right?
And I didn't know him, of course, then. And Mother Merritt and the kids stayed either in Whiting or in Sloan. I guess they lived both places.
I see. And what year was that? Did he go?
1905, they come to Salem, moved to Salem.
Was there a lot of unbroken ground yet around Salem in those days?
Well, not close where we lived.
I see.
Most farms had, that is 160 acres, would have a nice piece of pasture land and also hayland.
I see.
And there wasn't so much farm ground on 160 acres. So I suppose as people didn't raise so much livestock or didn't want the hay ground, they broke that up.
I see.
But where he worked was northwest of Salem, and I never was up that way too much, so I couldn't tell you much about that.
How did you meet your husband then? How did you meet your Orrin?
I think the first time I saw him possibly was at Sunday school.
I see. You were just children then?
Well, he was, let's see, he would have been, what, 12 years old?
1905. We've
Yeah.
almost
7, 12, 13 years old. I see. And,
And then he shocked grain for my brother Aaron.
I see. How did you get to know him better then in those days? Through the church or school, was it, or?
No, I never went to school where he went. We did go to Sunday school at the same schoolhouse, but Merritts lived west of where we lived, and Hosses lived east of where we lived. And if the Hosses went to the Merritts, they stopped and took us to the Merritts. And if the Merritts went to Hosses, they stopped and took us, that is my
I
younger
see.
sister and I,
Uh-huh.
to Hosses.
How did people court in those days? I mean, was it mostly you met in other people's homes then, or, I mean, if you wanted to get married to a girl, how did you meet her, and court her in those days?
Well, we just went places together.
What kind of places did you go to, Grandma?
To parties, neighborhood parties.
I see.
Sometimes to church, and once in a while to a movie. And believe me, you could go to a movie for 10 cents way back when.
Did they have were chaperones still in existence then or not?
Well, we didn't have any chaperones.
I see. Did you go north?
We went in a group.
Oh, I see.
Quite a lot, as I say. There was 3 of the Merritt kids, Orrin and Earl and Beulah. And if they were going to Hosses, we were no, it wasn't halfway between. We were near Hosses because they lived just a half a mile east of us. And there was Johnny and Millie Hoss. They were younger than we were, but then we were all in the same crowd. And then just a little ways down the road, there was 2 Dutcher boys. And the folks coming from the west would stop and pick us up, and we'd go east. And when the folks to the east were going to Merritt's, well, we went with them.
So it was kind of a family thing altogether.
Yes.
I see.
Was it planned to drop in more?
And a good many times when Orrin was taking me somewhere, Beulah or Earl or both of them went with us.
I see. When did you actually get married then?
In 1915, November 3rd, 1915. My brother Louis got married in 1912 and moved to North Dakota. After he was married, he come and spent the winter with the folks. And then he went back to North Dakota in March. And then the following year, in 1914, Orrin went to North Dakota and worked for Emma's brother. That was Louis' wife's brother.
I see.
And then when he come back, he and his father farmed together in 1915. That is, he rented a piece of ground and helped his father too, and used his father's machinery and horses to farm the piece of ground that he had. And then we got married in November 1915, but we weren't able to move to the home on account of the folks were expecting the baby that lived in the place that we were going to move to.
Oh, I see.
So we waited on them until after the baby was born in the spring before we moved to ourselves.
Now this was out on a farm too then?
Yes.
I see. When you, how many acres, when you were farming in those days, how many bushels to the acre of corn did you get in those days?
That depended on the year. In 1911, we had an awful poor crop. And that was after my brothers had left home, and I helped my father pick corn.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't get much corn that fall.
I see.
But there was time, I don't think ever there was any 100 bushel to the acre.
But they didn't figure so much bushels.
No.
I see. When you, did you sell any of that corn at all? Or did you keep it all when you farmed?
No, they sold some. My father never had many hogs or cattle.
Who would you sell the corn to, if you remember?
At the elevator.
At the elevator.
Or if there were some of the neighbors that wanted it to feed,
Oh.
they sold to them.
I see. How did you shell corn in those days?
You know, I had a picture I was going to show you, and I put that away somewhere, and I can't for the life of me tell you where it is. But this was a picture of where they were shelling corn by horsepower.
Mm-hmm.
8 head of horses running this.
Oh, in a circle?
Yeah.
I see.
And that must have been about 1906 or 7
I see.
that picture was taken.
Did that go on for a long time, that way of shelling corn?
No, they later,
Got a piece of
got-
machinery that was
mhm.
Do you remember the first time you ever saw an automobile?
I don't know that I can remember the first time I ever saw one, but the neighbors, these hosses that I talk about, was one of the first ones that had a Ford in our neighborhood. And then there was another man by the name of Sandstrom that had a Ford. Those were the first 2 cars.
Do you remember what year that was, Grandma? Approximately?
Well, that was before Orrin and I was married, but it couldn't have been too long before. But Johnny and Millie were our witnesses when we were married. And they took us, well, they didn't take me to the church because I lived in Salem at that time. But they took us home, took us out to Orrin's place in the Ford.
I see.
But I can't remember that we went in the Ford, you know, like going to Merritt's. Horses had wonderful horses, and they always drove, and Merritt's had horses, and they always drove horses. And then later on, I think that was when Elsie was a baby, Grandpa Merritt got a Maxwell car. It was the kind that had curtains on. And I can remember that so well because we were coming home from Matei's one night. That was, they'd had a dinner for Earl Merritt before he went to service. And it come up a hailstorm. And Grandpa Merritt drove up by the schoolhouse, and he and Orrin put the curtains on, the side curtains on the car in the shelter of the schoolhouse for us to come on home.
You talked about Orrin's brother. Was he drafted, or did he join the Army, or don't you remember?
I think he was drafted.
I see. Did they draft a lot of people up there, do you remember, Grandma? Or?
Quite a few. The man that Beulah married later was in the service there, and lots of other boys.
Was there any...
And Orrin was deferred on account of helping his father.
Oh, I see. Was there a lot of anti-German feeling in those days?
I think so.
Can you recall any incident that...
I don't remember that there was any riots or anything like that. No trouble, no violence.
But I mean, the people, they kind of took it out on the local Germans, did they, a little bit?
No, I don't believe so.
Oh, but I mean, the local Germans weren't picked on because they were Germans or anything like that.
You know, I never went out in company a whole lot.
I see.
So that is away from the neighborhood, you know, so I didn't know a lot about things like that.
Well, did people go out a lot in those days, Grandma? Or did they tend to stay quite close to home in those days?
Oh, there was the people that had dances and card parties and
I see. And then
things of that sort. But
just like now, some do and some don't.
That's right. We were not allowed to play cards or go to dances, so we didn't mingle with the crowd. Like, well, now the Merritts played cards, but the younger generation didn't dance. The older folks did.
I see. What kind of dances did they have? Did they have bands, local people play instruments? Or?
I think just some of the neighbors played some musical instrument. I don't think they ever hired a band to come in and play.
When you got married, did people give gifts, expensive store things, or did they tend to give like blankets and stuff they would make? Or?
No, we didn't have a wedding, you might say. We was married in the parsonage of the church. It wasn't an invitation affair.
I see. How, I mean, other people you knew when they got married, did, you know, like today everybody gives gifts and everything.
Oh, yes, they had big weddings.
I see. Did people tend to give things more of a, I mean, did they buy them in the store and then give them, or would they give gifts more like, you know, a quilt or a bedspread, or?
I think something like that. Now with us, Grandma Merritt gave us 2 dozen chickens, and Claude Merritt's wife gave us 2 dozen chickens, and Grandpa Merritt gave us a heifer.
I'll be darned. And that's what you started farming with?
Yes.
What did you do for farm equipment then when you started farming?
Orrin and his father farmed together. We used Orrin had bought a horse, and my father gave me a horse. And then Orrin helped his father. See, Earl was in service.
That's right.
And Orrin would help his father, and his father would help him, and they used Orrin's father's machinery. And then my brother-in-law, my oldest sister's husband, lived just a little ways from us, and he helped. In harvest time, Grandpa Merritt and John and I drove the binders, and Earl and Orrin and Bertie's husband done the shocking.
I see.
And we cut grain for on all 3 farms.
I see. The house you lived in, how big a house was that, Grandma? Was that a regular frame house, or?
Yes, it was the same house.
I want to sometime or find out when he went to Montana.
Who's that?
Grandma's father, because she said he looked for land in Minnesota and Montana. And I remember that we talked about when he went.
I have the picture of our house there. That's where the Merritts live.
I see. Oh, it was a good-sized house.
Is this Grandma's house?
This is Grandpa's.
Henry, yeah. This is Grandpa's house.
That's the big house.
This is Henry Merritt's house, right?
that Grandpa Merritt lived in.
Now you
That
had
was
these
built
pictures,
by
Grandma.
the-
Did people have box cameras in those days, or are these pictures all professional photographers would come
No,
around?
they had, now this brother-in-law of mine, John McCullough, he had a camera and took pictures.
I see it. Where would they send them to get them developed then, do you remember?
I think they must have taken them to Salem. There was a photographer in Salem.
I see. But this was the little black Kodak camera that they used, was it? Or was it quite a big thing?
Well, there's a camera over home that Orrin got from John McCullough, and it's probably just about this size
I
and
see.
set up about like that.
Uh-huh.
And those were taken
About 4 by 6.
on glass plates.
Oh, I see.
That's my folks' home in Salem.
I see. Now, when was this picture taken?
I don't know. That was after my folks were dead, I think.
I was going to say, this is not too many years ago,
No.
is it?
And that's the west end of the house.
Now, this is the house you moved into, or
No,
is that your parents?
That's
Oh, I
the same
see.
as that house.
Now, the house you moved into, you say you can't find that picture.
I don't know what in the world I've done with that. Because I had laid them. Now, this is the Millie horse I talked about, of our neighbor girl. And this is her brother John. And that's the Duke, one of the Dutcher boys. You see, when those kids come by going to the Merritts, they took us along.
Well, you were sort of fortunate that everyone was about the same age, weren't you?
Well, Johnny and Sis was a lot younger than I was. And that's my brother with a carpenter crew. Here's a picture of my folks' home.
I see. Was your house out on the farm similar to this, Grandma?
No. Well, I know where there is one. That is the place we were married.
Oh, I
in
see.
this part. And this was our first home.
I see.
Now, my folks had lived there before.
Oh, I
We
see.
did. Now, that wasn't as old a looking house as it looks like it is there.
Mm-hmm.
It was painted, I guess you'd say a buff color, like a good many houses in that neighborhood were painted. And this was high water in the spring. There's a little run down through the yard there. And off here, it doesn't show the culvert, I guess.
Yeah, I
Does
see
it?
it right there, yeah.
Well, the water would come through there and here and down along here. And then there was a bridge here, and there was a ravine come down to the pasture. And when the water was high, it would take this bridge out a good many times.
I see.
And then it went on this way and went through under the railroad track, and there was another little bridge on the other side, and it would take that out too when the water was high.
How many hours a day did Grandpa work then farming? I mean, was he up early in the morning and go all day, was he, or?
It depended on what had to be done.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like it is nowadays. If there's a rain or something that comes along and stops them, then they have to hurry to catch up their work.
How often did you go to town then? Or did you ever?
Whenever it was necessary.
I see. But I mean, you didn't make it a point to go to town every week or every...
Oh, I think father or mother or some of the family went to town every week because mother had a few eggs to sell and she used to sell butter.
I see. Would she sell these to the stores in town then?
Yes, they used to sell butter.
All your clothes when you were a child and in these days, did you buy those in the stores or were they mostly...
Mother bought the material and made our clothes.
Was that by hand?
Did she have
No,
a sewing?
she had a sewing machine. Mm-hmm.
I see. Do you remember the first time you got a ready-made dress?
No, I really don't.
I see. What was I going to say? Yeah, can't be too important. But I mean, did you buy many canned goods in those days either, from the stores? Or?
Oh, quite a few, and the folks were able to do it. And you know, you could buy 3 cans of tomatoes, those large cans, for a quarter, believe it or not.
Was there any, do you remember if, were those goods canned well? I mean, was there any danger of ever getting sick from those canned goods?
I don't think so.
You don't remember?
That is, if they emptied things out of the can.
Yeah.
GrandmaMerritt got poisoned on, I believe it was either salmon or sardines when he was by himself plowing, you know. But he left them in the can, left the can open, no way of refrigeration, you know.
I see. How, what about keeping meat around those days? Did you butcher as you needed it, or how did you...
Well, my folks butchered and cured the meat themselves, pork.
Uh-huh.
And, of course, when they butchered the beef, that was butchered in the wintertime.
I see.
And sometimes people had a large jar and salted the meat, put it in brine, and then you'd have to freshen it before you cooked it because it would be so salty.
How would you freshen it?
Put it in a skillet and boil it in water or a kettle. It depended. If you wanted to fry it, you sliced it and boiled it off a couple of times in water and then fried it.
Was there any ice available in those days?
Oh yes, we had ice houses.
Where did they get it in Salem there?
From the river.
What river is that?
We lived, there's a branch of the Vermilion River west of Salem, and then what they called the East Vermilion was between Salem and Montrose.
I see. And they would cut ice off that in the winter.
And they had ice houses that they stored the ice in.
Did those rivers ever flood there badly when you were there?
Not to cause any damage that I recall.
Do you remember any really bad blizzards in...
Oh, well, I know. Mother usually done the milking. They seldom had but one cow, and Mother done the milking. And Mother and Father, and I think there were just 2 of the boys home then, tied handkerchiefs over their faces. You know, the snow was so bad. And I think they took a rope from the barn to the house to find their way.
When was this? Do you remember what year this would be?
I don't.
Or did they just do that a lot of times?
I suppose it was in the years between 1905 and 1908 or 10.
I see. I'm going to have to turn the tape over here now.